So yeah, we'll just go through these. I'll talk about them. And then, like I said, a lot of the examples that, um, these talk about can come straight from, the Telltale Heart, right? They would fit with that. So the first one, let me zoom out just a little bit, has to do with setting. So a lot of times in these Gothic literature stories, and these are just things that there might be other types of fiction that have these things that we're going to look at, but Gothic literature kind of has a collection of them and combines them. So a lot of things have to do with the setting. You might have things like old rundown structures, especially castles or great country manors. Manors just means like a big sprawling home that someone has, like think of it like a mansion kind of out in the middle of nowhere in the country. Isolated away from other people, is a big thing. You might see things like hidden passages, trapdoors, dungeons, secret rooms, things like that. Decline from its former greatness. Now, we didn't read the story, but when we watched the video on the fall of the House of Usher, these last two things, they buried the dude's sister after she died in the dungeon. And, call it a dungeon. It was maybe think of it like a cellar too. But that decline from its former greatness, they talked about how well off that family was. And then by the time we see the house again, towards as a main character goes and visits him, it's falling apart. And then by the end of the video or in the end of the story too, the house completely crumbles, right? Bleak. And then these kind of things, just specific places, right? Bleak, foreboding environments. Foreboding means like impending danger or something like that. Dark forests are used often, imposing mountains, stormy weather, areas away from civilization. God said that isolation, atmosphere, just kind of like just a feeling you get. Mood could be a part of that too. Mystery, horror, and dread. So these are things that commonly come up as far as settings, like specific places, but also just, what's the environment like? Another element, and these things are going to be kind of specific, right? So we looked at setting. I don't know why this is so small up here at the top. Setting and atmosphere, that's one element. And then another element would be the protagonist. The protagonist, when you guys see that word, it's a long, fancy word for main character. So just think of that as a main character. The protagonist, Gothic literature always isolated or alone. In a Telltale Heart, our protagonist, and they're not always a hero. Like in a Telltale Heart, that dude is definitely not a hero, but he was the main character. He was who the story focused on. He was isolated and alone. I would say he was isolated from society, right? It was kind of just him and the old man together, and they don't, there's not much to. There wasn't really interactions with other characters. Like he wasn't going into town and doing anything. It was just kind of focused on the interactions with between him and the old man. So I guess you could say there's some isolation there, until the end when the cops show up. Physical, some physical elements. They might be trapped in a house far from civilization, and which I would say applies to a Telltale Heart. Not necessarily like he was trapped there, like by someone was forcing him to be there, but just due to his situation, he was in that setting. And again, didn't necessarily leave or go anywhere. Emotional, cut off from people around her. And it says her, this could be him or her. Self-imposed or result of circumstances beyond control. So that would fit, kind of what we said about being trapped somewhere. Main character in a Telltale Heart, he was in that situation, which kind of forced him to be at the house all the time. The plot involves hidden secrets which threaten the protagonist. And that's a common one you see in a Telltale Heart, that, the quote unquote hidden secret didn't threaten the protagonist. It threatened the old man who he kills later on. He had that plan to kill him very early on in the story. The old man didn't know that. We knew that. So you could also say it's an example of dramatic irony. Us knowing more than all the characters do. Again, and that just means the protagonist, again, long word for main character. A lot of emotions are dealt with in Gothic literature. You definitely see that in a Telltale Heart, just generally with that the protagonist there. He kind of had those emotional extremes, and that's kind of where he stayed. He didn't wasn't very even, right? It was always one extremely upset, extremely angry. So emotions run high. In Gothic literature, characters are often passionate and strong-willed, defying others and even their own common sense in pursuit of their goals. Uh, that's the case with a lot of them. I think in a Telltale Heart, I think in his mind, everything that he did made sense to him, not to us, but to him. So I think that's a little bit different. But there are definitely defying others to pursue those goals. His goal is ultimately just kill the man because of his eye. Um, Women are often curious and have a tendency to swoon, while men storm and rage in reflection of unseen inner torments. A common thing that you'll see. Didn't apply to a Telltale Heart just because of limited characters. When I had, two characters that are featured throughout, and then just the policeman at the end. The events in Gothic literature emphasize high emotion and often reflect a heightened sense of drama. And I think that's definitely the case, especially, the last page of A Telltale Heart when he's hearing the heartbeat. That he has that great inner struggle going on in his mind. And it's kind of causing him torment within himself. And I think, again, that's probably coming from his guilt. And then examples of this include murders, fits with our example. Kidnappings, people going mad, also fits with our example. Tragic illnesses, I think you could definitely say that guy had some type of mental illness. So that would fit with that too. Next element, damsels in distress. Now, this one does not apply to Telltale Heart at all, but it's probably something that you guys have seen before. So the damsel in distress motif appears quite often in Gothic literature, with women threatened by tyrannical men or just circumstances with which they find themselves in. So it's basically that kind of old trope of a woman needing to be saved. I think now looking at that, if some people look at that trope or that concept is kind of critically, nowadays, and I kind of agree with that too a lot of times. But this is something that back then really common. An example, Sleeping Beauty is an example of that. I think even like Snow White, where just some random dude has to come in and save them. Again, it seems kind of silly now, especially to me, but it is a commonly used motif or trope that they use. They often appear frightened and suffer from some kind of ailment. I don't really remember Sleeping Beauty. I guess she was sleeping all the time. I don't know. She needed saving. But yeah, that is, again, and I agree with what someone said in the chat about women not needing to be saved 100%. And I think Disney movies kind of reinforce that with a lot of people, unfortunately. But luckily, today we don't see this as much, and I'm kind of thankful for that. It is one of those older, kind of more dated, I would call it, tropes. Foreboding. So what this means is that it's just the feeling, the atmosphere that something bad is gonna happen. And it might be something laid out. It might be someone knowing that their death is coming, right? Or it might just be a feeling that something, maybe non-specific, something bad is going to happen. So ominous, this just means kind of threatening. Implications precede or come before dark events in Gothic literature. So again, we might know what's going to happen. We might not, but we just know that something's going to happen. All these stories a lot of times establish that from the beginning, that there's just something bad. In A Telltale Heart, within the first few lines, he says, it was my intention to kill the old man, or I decided I had to take his life or something. So very early on, they established that thing, that idea, that foreboding, and again, being another element. Unlucky omens appear, ancient curses linger in the air. These are just some examples. Dark forces beyond the protagonist's control thwart his ambitions. That kind of means they stop him from reaching his goals, right? And I think that did happen in A Telltale Heart at the beginning, because ideally you think he'd want to get away with murdering the old man. That's what I would think. But he didn't, right? Because there were those things beyond his control. So his guilt, I think, at that point was beyond his control. His mental state, his kind of unraveling was beyond his control at that point. And it kept him from getting away with it. And I know the text itself didn't really say what happened to him, but the one live action video and the cartoon kind of, I like how they added some type of post event. Either with the cartoon he was locked up in some type of institution. He had a straitjacket, he was in a padded room and everything else. And then in the live action one, that he was hung for what he did, which kind of makes sense given the time which it took place. And then another element, and we have this one, and I think one more, the idea of decay. So the overall impression of the Gothic world is one of decay. Again, a formerly great family, a community, country, or individual who has peaked and now begins a slow process of decline. And I think that in regards to a telltale heart, this doesn't as much make sense or apply to it, but it definitely does apply to the fall of the House of Usher, with that, talking about how the family was once great, wealthy, and everything else, and then now they're on this massive decline. This appears both in the landscape. You might see things like crumbling buildings, and then in the characters themselves. Absolutely applies to a telltale heart. The characters, you could say that their mental state is crumbling. Their mental state is in some type of decay, if you want to look at it that way. And then last one, just being the supernatural. I think this is something that we've all seen in Gothic literature, but again, you see this all the time in all types of different fiction. Just things that seem impossible that are happening, in this real world type setting. They might seem impossible, or they might actually be impossible. So I'll start reading from here. Supernatural often appears in Gothic literature, particularly ghosts and then unexplained manifestations. You could say him hearing the heartbeat towards the end of the story was a manifestation of that, right? It was happening in his mind, but you could say, oh, it's some supernatural force that's causing this to happen. But then it does get explained. I think it's explained. They don't explicitly, the author doesn't come out and say it, but I conclude that that's all happening in his mind, and it's not supernatural. It has that kind of real world explanation. It's just because of his mental state. So that's what their second bullet point comes in. In some Gothic novels or stories, these elements ultimately have a rational explanation, but the implication always suggests something not of his world. So what Edgar Allan Poe did with that is, you could say that it was something supernatural, like the man was coming back from the dead, all these different things. But again, my conclusion after reading it is that it was all in his mind, right? So it does have that real world expectation. And what we'll do is, before we'll have one more thing to look at. We'll look at our assignment for today, because it does have to do with those notes. So once you guys go through those, and I would read them again just to get a better idea of what's going on. So we have two things: the oval portrait. Again, this is text we're working on this whole week. There's the text. I'm not going to go through that. Here's a pre-reading assignment. So first page of this, we should all be pretty familiar with as far as directions go. So it says, based on what you know about Gothic literature, which is what we just covered, what themes, concepts, or ideas do you think the oval portrait will focus on? So just knowing that it's a piece of Gothic literature, knowing that alone, knowing what you do know about Edgar Allan Poe, what do you think this might focus on? 2, what story, joy that has a twist ending? What makes these type of endings effective? Movies and literature. You could talk about The Lottery. That's an example of that. Some definitions, same as always. These are all in the text, and they should be straight up in the text, like they normally would. I don't think there's any words we got to fix. I know there was one that was said convened, but it should have been conceived last week. Not the case with this week. These are all in the text. And then we'll have a quiz assignment on these later on in the week. So let's make sure you guys get these down. So now just looking specifically at our skill for this week, talking about Gothic literature itself. Directions here, it says, in Gothic literature, the reader goes from the normal order of everyday world into a dark region ruled by supernatural beings, a region that inspires dread and horror, where decay abounds and death is always at hand. It's a little bit extra, but you get the point. Gothic literature uses settings, mood, characters, emotions, concepts, and themes to create a disturbing method of storytelling. Most pieces of Gothic literature share similar elements and concepts. And again, they might not have all of them, but they're going to have a few of them at least. Using your Gothic literature notes, identify elements in the text, the oval portrait, that makes it true Gothic literature. So I'm telling you that this is Gothic literature, but basically what you're doing is going into the text and then proving that to me. So you'll have a text example, the element. Now, each of those slides that we looked at covered one element. So the first slide was on settings and atmosphere. The second slide was on the protagonist. Next one was on emotions, damsel in distress, that concept. Foreboding, which again, just think something bad's going to happen. Decay, and then the supernatural. So those are your elements. You're going to choose one of those to put in this middle column. And then your justification, just explain that. You like always, pretty much everything we do like this, you will have a justification, just because sometimes if it's just these two, you might have a text example and then you might have an element. And I might say to myself, I don't really agree with that. But that justification is just to help you guys out to explain it a little bit more. This example is from A Telltale Heart. So this isn't in the oval portrait. I just wanted to pick one again that we were familiar with. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped in the room. He shrieked once. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. So the element that I think that went with was emotions, because it shows that he's at that high emotional state. He's kind of like at the end of his rope. And for my justification, I kind of pulled this straight from the slide that we looked at. I think I just copy and pasted it. Actually, it says elements of Gothic literature include murders, kidnappings, people going mad, and tragic illnesses. So my justification is just to say that we have a murder right there and you have somebody going mad from that text example. Now, you might say, because I think you have 5 to do, right? So you might pick protagonist for one, setting for one, damsel in distress for one. You might do that, or you might see 2 examples of settings and atmosphere, right? Or you might have 2 examples or more, hopefully not more, try to use different ones, but of something with that heightened emotion. Or you might have more than one example of the supernatural. So just because they have these things, an element in there one time, doesn't mean that that's it. You might have more than one. So that's your pre-reading assignment. Again, I'll Zoom with you guys tomorrow, just so we can talk about the plot assignment, because we haven't talked about it in a minute. But hopefully that stuff on Gothic literature made sense to you guys.